G'day there, I'm Greg Curran. Welcome to my Innovation Coaching webinar series. So you've heard about podcasting and you'd like to give it a go, but perhaps you're wondering, where do I start? What do I focus on? And how do I get my students interested, creating something that's got a bit of edge? Well, if that sounds like you, jump on board my 3-part webinar series. I'll help you get clear and focused with a solid plan and support system. Before we get started though, a little bit about me. I'm a lecturer in teacher education, host of the podcast Pushing the Edge with Greg Curran, and an innovation coach that works with school leaders and teachers. Now, I can't quite believe it, but I've been in education now for over 28 years, working as a classroom teacher, an English language teacher, a lecturer, and a manager. And throughout that time, regardless of the setting, one thing's absolutely driven me, and that's a desire to shake things up and innovate. So let's get started. Let's create an innovative podcast. When we're excited about a new idea like podcasting, we can often get confused and distracted with all the possibilities. They all look pretty good, right? We head off down one path and then suddenly see something shiny and new and head off down that path. We can end up taking on something that's not realistic given our situation, the time we have available, and the everyday pressures we're dealing with as teachers. We can get started and before too long find ourselves exhausted or overwhelmed. That's why we're focusing on clarity in this webinar. I'm going to take you through a 3-stage process that helps you to get clearer about what to focus your podcast on. Together we'll uncover your foundation for podcasting. We'll identify the key challenges you want to meet, and we'll brainstorm the possibilities before narrowing down to one podcast idea that you'll take forward in our next webinar. Okay, let's get started. What works in your classroom? That's your base, the foundation that we're going to build your podcast on. You'll need a couple of blank sheets of paper here, plus some pens, pencils, or texters. Okay, let's shine the light now over your past year in the classroom. What were your top 4 peak moments? Those moments when you and your students absolutely shone, when you went above and beyond what you thought was possible, when you knocked it right out of the park. Perhaps here you'd like to close your eyes to remember these peak moments. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? What are you doing in these moments? What are the students doing? Hit pause on this video now and write or draw your responses. Let's dig a little deeper now and identify what was working in these peak moments using my SPACE model. This will form the foundation that we tap into and build on for your podcast. It'll give us a sense of direction, especially as I'll be honing in on the aspects that I think are crucial for podcasting. We'll start with strengths. What were your students' strengths in these moments? What were your strengths? If colleagues were watching your class during these peak moments, what would they say about your strengths as a community? Are there any groups of students that have specific strengths? Are there students that have quite unique strengths? And what about you? What would your colleagues say about your strengths in these moments? And one more question to consider. What teaching practices and mindsets have contributed to the development of these strengths, as well as your students' confidence in tapping into them? Hit pause now and jot down your responses. What passions do you see, hear, and feel in these peak moments? Passions that compel your students, that they just can't help but be drawn to, that they'd participate in all day long if they could. How about agency and action? Here I'm going to connect agency with student voice. So what would you say about your students' level of confidence in their voice in each of these peak moments? What would you say about their sense of agency, their confidence in their ability to take action, knowing that they can and will make an impact? And what have you done as a class that supported and encouraged their voice, their sense of agency in these moments? Hit pause and write down what comes to mind. Now, let's turn to action. What would you say about your students' problem-solving skills in each of these peak moments? Their initiative, their willingness to get involved and take action. Are they prepared to critically reflect, to persevere, to adjust and refine when something doesn't work? And what classroom practices have helped or supported their problem solving in each of these moments? As you cast your mind back over these top 4 moments, how are your students collaborating? Are they in small groups or moving in and out of groups? Do some students stick with the same group? Maybe some prefer to work by themselves, just touching base every now and again with others in the class. What roles do they take on when collaborating? Do they tend to take on one role more than others? Or are they able to move in and out of different roles? And if you were able to sum up these moments, what would you say are your students' strengths in terms of collaboration? And what are their challenges? How would you describe your students' engagement in these moments? What did it look like, sound like? What was it about these moments that upped your students' level of engagement? What drew them in and kept them engaged? And what have you done previously in class that you think has contributed to the engagement in these moments? Here you might be thinking of specific practices, approaches, or mindsets that you encourage and support. So you've now identified and fleshed out your class's foundation for podcasting. Keep this foundation in mind as we move into the second part of our webinar. So how's it going so far? Have you got any nagging questions or any issues that you're not sure how to work through? Or maybe you'd like some additional support or encouragement? If so, drop me a line at greg@pushingtheedge.org or click on the coaching link for further information about my one-to-one coaching program. As you imagine podcasting with your class, what challenges do you anticipate within and outside your classroom? I'd encourage you here to frame the challenges in terms of the positive. So if you think you're going to have a hard time getting your colleagues to give podcasting a go, you might frame the challenge as getting your colleagues to buy into podcasting, or connecting podcasting to what matters for my colleagues. Here's some possible challenges to get you started. How to link podcasting to your school policy, your school vision, and standards. You've probably got lots on your plate, so how do you keep the podcasting doable and something you're able to keep going? How do you get your students interested in podcasting? What's going to motivate them and encourage them to continue even when things go wrong? Your audience for your podcast is absolutely vital because we want to get them interacting with your students. So who are your audience? What do you know about them? What would draw them to your class podcast and keep them engaging with your students? What will be the hooks? What will be the edge that gets them in? Given that podcasting demands a wide range of knowledge and skills, how will you cater for this given the mixed levels of knowledge and skills in your class? Okay, so there's some possible challenges. So let me now throw it over to you. What challenges do you foresee with podcasting? Jot down whatever comes to mind without any censoring. Then come back and nominate your top 5 or 6 challenges. We'll return to this list in a moment, so keep it handy. Okay, so we've uncovered your foundation for podcasting. We've identified the key challenges in your podcasting journey. Now we're going to branch out and think of all the podcast possibilities we can. As you brainstorm podcast possibilities, keep in mind your purpose or reason for podcasting, as well as the audience. This is crucial. Here's 5 podcasting ideas to get you started. 1. A subject or an initiative-based podcast. Maybe you'd like to do a podcast on an out there initiative that you've got going in your class, like Genius Hour or Makerspaces. Maybe you'd like to create a podcast on a special reading program that you've got going in your classroom. 2. A newsletter podcast. How about a podcast that captures all the exciting, funny and out there things that are happening in your school or your year level? 3. What about an interest-based podcast? Think back to your students' passions. How might you tap into these passions within a podcast? 4. A community-focused podcast. What are the key issues in your community? What stirs your students? How about an activist-focused podcast, showing how they're making a difference on an issue that really matters to them? 5. How about a needs-based podcast? What do the students in your year level or school really want to know about? What about students outside your school, locally or globally? You could create a podcast that addresses those needs. So, over to you now. What are your ideas for podcasting? Go wild, no limits, anything is possible here. You might even want to open the brainstorming door to your students and see what they come up with. After you've exhausted your imagination, start narrowing down your list to your top 4 or 5 ideas. Be daring here, willing to stretch yourself and your students. Be prepared to create a podcast that pushes the edge. Create something that others will talk about and eagerly await each new episode. So, what jumps out at you as you look through the list? Once you've got your top 4 to 5 podcast ideas, we'll evaluate them. Okay, grab that list of challenges that you generated earlier. Take each podcast idea one by one. See how it stacks up against your challenges. Which podcast idea will enable you to hit most of your challenges? Now that you've narrowed your list down to one likely contender, let's run that contender through one more filter. What would you say to someone who says, just because you can, for example, create a Genius Hour podcast, doesn't mean you should? What would be your top 3 to 4 arguments? Now don't hold back here, go with your hunches. Why have you chosen this focus for your podcast? Refer back to the SPACE model you completed earlier, where we focused on your students' strengths and passions. That'll probably help you out here. This is where you should end up. A description of your podcast idea, a brief sentence detailing your purpose for the podcast, and a short description of your audience or your listeners. Take some time on this aspect. What are their key interests and questions? Maybe your students could do some action research here. By really knowing your audience, you can tailor your show content towards them and keep them tuning in. In our next Innovation Coaching by Example webinar, we'll take your podcast idea and flesh it out. You'll learn a couple of especially helpful strategies on this front. We'll develop clear, concrete goals and identify key milestones to meet in your podcast journey. Plus, we'll build in accountability strategies to challenge you and to keep you on track. Find out more by going to pushingtheedge.org and click on Webinar. While you're there, sign up to download the planning worksheets for this webinar series, plus my compilation of useful podcasting resources. Go to pushingtheedge.org and click on Webinar. I hope this webinar has got you all fired up and ready to go with your podcast idea. If you've got any questions or any comments, feel free to drop me a line at greg@pushingtheedge.org. And if you'd like some additional support to get started with your podcasting, or maybe you'd like to take your podcasting to the next level, whatever the reason, I'm here to support you. Click on the coaching link for further information about my one-to-one coaching program, or go to pushingtheedge.org and click on coaching. Now, if you found this webinar useful, would you do me a favour and share it? I'd really appreciate it. I'm Greg Curran. Thanks for watching, and whatever you do, keep pushing the edge.